just variation within kind, alleles with variation this way, brand new genes. Evolutionists would never let it happen. They thrive on confusion because they can make you believe there's a new gene. What is it? It's just a different variety of an old gene. A really new gene is the one that had Dawkins just fumbling around in the air looking for something that there weren't any examples of. Another question or comment? This can be on anything. Yes?
Can you make new species with plants?
Yes, you can. Now, I got to tell you that species started off being the same word as biblical created kind. And so there's a word in Hebrew, and I wouldn't be surprised if you know this, M-I-N, min, which is used in Genesis, and it means created kind. And at first, the man who told us how to classify things, he used what the Bible said, that living things were created to multiply after their kind. So two things belong to the same kind if they can have offspring, if they can have children, if they're people, if they can have dogs and cats and people, if they're dogs and cats and so on. Or if they're a radish, they can have radishes and things like that, seeds of the same kind. But then later on, people began to use species to mean something much smaller than a created kind. And so the created kinds are actually, have a lot of variability in them. And so in some senses you can. Radishes and cabbages, for instance, look a lot different, don't they? And yet they belong to the same created kind. One has a big red root that's delicious, a radish, and one has a big green leaf that's delicious, I guess, cabbage. But believe it or not, you can cross cabbages and radishes, and you can get a rabbage or a caddish, okay? The bad news is, and you can call that a different species because it's different than one that's commonly seen in nature. And so when you get it, though, guess what happened? The caddish or the rabbage had the leaves of the radish and the root of the cabbage. So this was not an instant success, but it was, in a sense, a new species. Now, it was just a new species in the little sense. It was a smaller subdivision of a large created kind. For instance, you can take dogs, and we have, breeders take dogs and horses and cats and breed all kinds of them. Big ones. Think of the dogs. You have big dogs, little dogs, yappy dogs, quiet dogs, smart dogs, not so smart dogs, long snouted dogs, pug-nosed dogs, short-haired dogs, long-haired dogs, mean dogs, quiet dogs, all kinds of variety. And if they weren't alive today and all we found were their bones, we would think they were different species, lots of different species, but because they're on Earth right now and they can interbreed, we know that they're the same created kind. But you say, well, now wait a minute. Could a St. Bernard and a little teeny Chihuahua, really have a puppy? Well, probably not. But in the lab, they could. And so you could cross a St. Bernard and a little, Chihuahua, a little teeny dog, and you could get a cross. It would look just like a mutt. It'd be kind of in between those. And so you can make up species. In plants, you can do it like crazy because you can take the pollen from one flower, and put it on a different variety. And plants, you can trick them with hormones to grow in all kinds of different sizes and shapes. And so it's just different varieties among the kinds that God created. We can't make a new created kind, but we can make a new species within the created kind. And sometimes we want to. In Florida, we make oranges and combinations of oranges that taste better or bigger or juicier or come on at different times of the year than the regular orange that you see out in nature. So we can do a real good job of that. And that's actually following God's example. He told us to, till the earth and keep it, and to cultivate the earth. Well, cultivate means cherish, nourish, bring out the full potential. So when a farmer or an animal breeder is actually, crossing different things, looking for different colors and sizes and shapes, he's actually, just showing the world the range of variety that God built in ahead of time. And we can call it a new species. You can even get a patent on it. Of course, now we can make artificial species in the lab, mixing DNA from different things. And yeah, we'll see how that, that's a little more dangerous. But does that answer your question? Okay, very good. Any other questions or comments? And I'll let Pastor Scott tell me what we need to move downstairs. But, or, is that time come? Let's see, Bill, we'll do one more, maybe one more after this. If there is one more, I'll take one more after Bill's.
Has anybody ever crossbred a polar bear with a brown bear?
I don't think you even have to have anybody do it. Bears cross in nature. And in this case, they cross generic lines. So polar bears, brown bears, grizzly bears, Kodiaks, some of these are given different genus names, not just different species names. Yet in nature, where their range overlaps, they'll produce hybrids on their own. You don't have to do it in a lab. And one of the big things is when you go to study nature, well, I take students, well, you've probably been actually in the mountains there of California to live oaks. Or you look at manzanita, and you read the guidebook, and we were looking at prickly pear cactus, Ken Cumming and I, and you look at the book, and it says this species, I'll go with the cactus, this species has 3 spines and a paddle, 5 to 7 inch long, and you look for one, you can never find one. And this one had, 5 spines in a bundle and had paddles that were smaller, and they were just all mixed up. And the live oaks and they're all mixed up. And the manzanita, and they're all mixed up. They've all hybridized because they're not true species. They're just variations of the same created kind, just like the people in the room here. Okay, you get the last question. Yes. Say again?
What are generic kinds?
What are generic kinds? Okay, generic kinds are a little bigger group than species, or a little bigger group than created kind. And so the created kinds are the ones whose ancestors God created, during the creation work. And so they multiplied and after their kind. And so dogs would be an example of a created kind, and cats would be an example of a created kind. But you can put them together in larger groups. And so when we look around at what God did, we look at all the different kinds of things that God created, we say, well, look, there's some similarities between dogs and cats. And so dogs and cats were different created kinds, and the first dogs and the first cats were made specially by God. But when scientists look at them, or when just people look at them, they say, well, dogs and cats are both furry. And so because they're both furry, they give their babies milk when they're born. And they'll say, well, cows do that. Now, nobody would get a cow mixed up with a cat or a dog. And monkeys do that. Nobody would get a monkey mixed up with a cat or a dog. But we group them together in bigger categories based on other traits they have in common. And so that's what we mean by genus is one level, and family, and we can group them together. So we'll say these are animals and they're different from plants in this way. And that's human beings looking at what God created, looking for patterns that help us understand what we see, that reflect God's plan. And that's really handy, because when we group things like that, we can look for similarities, and then we can maybe kind of figure out where animals might live, or where to look for a plant. Maybe this plant produces a really good medicine, and we know this kind of feature. We'll say, boy, these plants live in this environment. Let's go see if we can find some more varieties of this kind of plant. So it's kind of helpful to know that. All righty, well, maybe I'll do one more then. Thank you.
I've heard about, I can't remember the correct pronunciation of the Langling province in China.
Oh, yeah.
Scientists are discovering that many varieties of dinosaurs that are completely covered in feathers.
Oh, yes.